November 15th, 1963. On the industrial waterfront of Bayonne, New Jersey, something was about to happen that would expose one of the most extraordinary financial frauds in American history. For months, millions of dollars had been lent against enormous quantities of vegetable oil, supposedly sitting inside a massive tank farm. The paperwork said the oil was there, the warehouse receipts said it was there, and the institution certifying that inventory carried a name people trusted around the world: American Express. But that morning, inspectors arrived to take a closer look. They weren't simply checking paperwork anymore, they wanted to see the oil. And when they began examining the tanks, they discovered something that made almost no sense. The tanks were supposed to be filled with valuable vegetable oil. Instead, much of what was inside was water, and that discovery would send shockwaves through Wall Street. The trick itself was almost embarrassingly simple. Vegetable oil is lighter than water. Put the two together and the oil rises to the top. The people behind the scheme understood that basic piece of physics. So instead of filling the enormous storage tanks entirely with vegetable oil, much of the tank could be filled with water, and vegetable oil could be put on top. From above, everything could look normal. An inspector could measure the level. The measuring equipment could come back coated in oil. The surface looked like oil. The tank appeared full, but the measurement couldn't tell them what was underneath. And that tiny weakness in the inspection process became the foundation of a fraud worth hundreds of millions of dollars in claimed inventory and losses. The man behind it was Anthony Angelis. Most people knew him as Tino. He wasn't a Wall Street banker. He wasn't a financial theorist. He was a businessman who had built his career in the food industry. And he had already learned an important lesson about American business. Government programs, commodity markets, credit, paperwork, and trust could be turned into enormous opportunities if you knew how to work the system. In the 1950s, DeAngelis created Allied Crude Vegetable Oil Refining Corporation. The company became heavily involved in the export of food commodities, including vegetable oil. And for a while, the business was legitimate. There was real oil. There were real transactions. There were real customers. But as the company grew, so did its appetite for borrowed money. And that's where American Express entered the story. In late 1961, American Express entered the field warehousing business. The idea was simple. A company would store valuable commodities inside a warehouse or controlled storage facility. An independent warehousing company would monitor that inventory. Then it could issue warehouse receipts documenting what was supposedly being held. Those receipts could be used as collateral. To a bank or broker, a warehouse receipt wasn't just a piece of paper. It represented something physical: oil. Millions of dollars worth of oil. So if the receipt said the oil existed, money could be borrowed against it. And American Express had something even more valuable than the paper itself. It had a reputation for trust. DeAngelis understood exactly how powerful that could be. At first, Allied actually had substantial quantities of vegetable oil. American Express issued legitimate receipts for real inventory. But then the numbers began to grow. Allied started claiming more oil than it actually possessed. The problem was obvious. Eventually, someone would have to verify it. So American Express sent inspectors to the Bayonne tank farm. The storage tanks were enormous. Some held hundreds of thousands of gallons. An inspector standing at the top of one of those tanks couldn't simply climb inside and look around. Instead, the inventory was measured, and that was exactly what DeAngelis needed, because he had found a way to make a tank full of water look like a tank full of oil. The operation was brutally simple. Water went into the tanks. Vegetable oil went on top. Because oil floats, the surface looked exactly like what the inspectors expected. The inspection equipment came down through the top. The reading appeared normal, and when the equipment came back up, there was oil on it. From the inspector's perspective, the evidence seemed to confirm the paperwork. The tank contained oil, but the measurement was telling only part of the truth. It told them what was happening at the surface. It didn't tell them what was happening below it, and that difference was worth millions. But the water wasn't DeAngelis's only trick. The operation also used the enormous network of tanks and connecting pipes to move oil around. If creditors wanted to inspect one tank, the valuable oil could be moved there. The same inventory could effectively appear in different places at different times. And investigators later found other deceptive methods as well, including hidden arrangements inside tanks designed to make the apparent quantity of oil look much greater than it really was. The result was a system where the physical inventory remained relatively small, while the paperwork describing that inventory became enormous. This is where the scam became much bigger than a tank full of water. The warehouse receipts could be used to obtain financing. Allied could borrow money against inventory that wasn't really there. That money could then be used to buy more commodities and take even larger positions in the market. More borrowing created more trading. More trading created the need for more collateral, and more collateral meant more warehouse receipts. The system fed itself. As long as everyone believed the oil existed, the machine could keep running. And by 1963, Allied was claiming an extraordinary amount of vegetable oil. On paper, Angelis had created an ocean of oil. In reality, much of that ocean was water. But Angelis wasn't satisfied with simply borrowing against imaginary inventory. He wanted to make an enormous amount of money in the futures market. His plan was essentially to buy so much vegetable oil futures that he could help drive prices higher. The more the price increased, the more valuable his position became. And the more valuable his position became, the stronger his financial empire appeared. By November 1963, Allied had become the buyer in roughly 90% of the future oil contracts on the exchange. It was an extraordinary position, but it created an enormous weakness because futures contracts are settled every day. If prices rise, you make money. If prices fall, you owe money, sometimes very quickly. And Angelis had built an empire that depended on prices continuing to rise. Then the market turned against him. The price of vegetable oil futures began to fall, and suddenly, the enormous positions that had made Angelis look powerful became a financial trap. Margin calls started arriving. Millions of dollars were demanded. Cash had to be produced immediately. But Allied didn't have enough real money to cover the losses. And there was another problem. The company could no longer simply keep borrowing against its supposed inventory because the entire system depended on those warehouse receipts. And now people were beginning to question what those receipts were actually worth. The illusion was starting to crack. On November 15th, inspectors arrived at the Bayonne facility. This time, they didn't rely on the same basic measurement that had allowed the deception to continue. They used weighted sampling equipment to determine what was actually inside the tanks. And by around 10 o'clock that morning, the truth was becoming clear. There wasn't anywhere near as much vegetable oil as the paperwork claimed. The company had represented roughly $150 million of oil collateral. The actual vegetable oil was worth only about $6 million. The difference was staggering. More than $100 million of supposed collateral had effectively vanished. But the oil hadn't vanished. In many cases, it had never been there. The discovery didn't stay in New Jersey. It raced straight into the financial system. Banks had lent money against the warehouse receipts. Brokers had accepted those receipts as collateral. Trading firms had entered enormous contracts on Allied's behalf. And one of the most important firms caught in the middle was Ira Haupt and Company. Haupt had become deeply involved in Allied's commodity trading. When Allied couldn't meet its obligations, Haupt was exposed to enormous losses. The brokerage firm's financial position deteriorated rapidly, and suddenly, Wall Street had a much bigger problem than a dishonest commodity trader. The problem was that the entire financial system around him had trusted the collateral. Ira Haupt was one of the oldest and most respected brokerage firms in New York. Now it was in serious trouble. The New York Stock Exchange was confronted with the possibility that a major brokerage failure could create panic among thousands of customers. The exchange intervened. The firm was forced into liquidation, and millions of dollars had to be put behind the effort to protect customers and prevent the failure from spreading even further. A scam that had started inside steel storage tanks in New Jersey had now reached the heart of Wall Street. Then came the damage to American Express. American Express had not created the fraud, but its warehousing subsidiary had helped certify the inventory that became the foundation of the scheme. And that meant American Express was now facing enormous claims. Its reputation was damaged, its stock price fell sharply, and the company was forced to deal with the consequences of a failure in a system built around trust. The scandal became one of the most serious crises in the company's history, and all of it had started with a deceptively simple question: how much oil is actually inside that tank? The final numbers were extraordinary. Allied had used warehouse receipts representing roughly 1.8 billion pounds of vegetable oil as collateral. It obtained approximately $180 million in financing and related credit based on that supposed inventory. But the actual physical stock was nowhere close to what the paperwork claimed, and the losses spread across dozens of companies and financial institutions. American Express was hit. Banks were hit. Brokerage firms were hit. Commodity traders were hit. Insurance companies were hit. The fraud had become so large that almost nobody who touched the paper was completely insulated from the collapse. Anthony Tino Angelis was eventually charged with fraud and conspiracy. The man who had spent years building a financial empire around vegetable oil was now facing prison. He pleaded guilty to 4 charges, and in 1965, he was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. The empire was gone. The tanks were no longer symbols of enormous wealth, and the warehouse receipts that had once been treated as valuable collateral had become evidence of one of the most notorious commodity frauds in American history. What makes the salad oil swindle so disturbing isn't that DeAngelis discovered some futuristic way to steal money. He didn't. There was no computer, no sophisticated cyber attack, no advanced technology. He used water, oil, pipes, paper, and trust. The inspector trusted the measurement, the lender trusted the warehouse receipt, the broker trusted the collateral, and everyone trusted the institutions standing behind the system. That's what allowed the fraud to grow, because the system didn't fail when DeAngelis poured water into a tank. It failed when thousands of people trusted paperwork more than reality. And for years, that paperwork was worth millions, until one morning in November 1963, someone finally looked inside and discovered that behind one of the biggest financial illusions on Wall Street, there was mostly water.